In addition to those nutritional issues, some other health issues that come up in adolescence have to do with the risky behavior that we discussed earlier. So things like engaging in risky sexual behaviors and also consuming like drugs and alcohol. So some of the hormonal changes that are happening during puberty obviously lead to an increased sex drive. So teenagers have a large motivation to engage in sex. And in the US, there's a really large percentage of teenagers who are sexually active. And that number, of course, increases as the age goes up. So this is showing boys in red, girls in yellow. And this is the percentage of them that have had sexual intercourse. So by age 19, about 70% of boys and girls have become sexually active or have had sex. So it's extremely common in the US and in most countries, really. North American attitudes are obviously really restrictive about sex, and teenagers often get mixed messages from their sort of parents and the school system versus the media that they're exposed to. So parents and school system are often saying, just be abstinent, basically, don't have sex at all. But then media is portraying all kinds of sexual behaviors in teenagers and adults. And so that can be very conflicting, which can confuse teenagers and contribute to these large numbers of sexual activity. Some of the influences of sexualized media exposure. So adolescents who are more exposed to sexual TV shows and movie are more likely to have sex and also to have risky, unprotected sex. And that's probably likely due to the way that the media portrays it. So most movies and TV shows that you watch, if it's like a romantic comedy or something and the couple ends up having sex, it's always shown as being like spontaneous. You almost never see them first stopping to discuss if they should use condoms or contraceptives or anything like that. They always just kind of launch into it and it's fun and whatever, and they don't really show the consequences of that. Whereas obviously in the real world, you need to take time with your partner to discuss methods for preventing pregnancy and STDs, and media just doesn't really show that. And so if teenagers aren't getting any information from their parents, or their parents are just telling them don't have sex, but then they see movies and TV shows where sex happens in this spontaneous way, then they are likely to just mimic that behavior and then engage in really risky sexual practices. Exposure to internet pornography in particular can increase problems with adjusting to puberty and can contribute to all kinds of sexual issues. Despite everything I just said, it is true that in the most part, attitudes in the US and other Western cultures for adolescents and adults toward non-marital sex have become more accepting. So people are more open to talking about it. And I already said substantial percentage of US teenagers are sexually active. So according to this number, which I would guess is probably low because this is coming from surveys where you're asking teenagers questions and they would have a high motivation to lie about this kind of thing. But 14% of US sexually active teenagers do not use contraception consistently. This graph is just showing the rates of use of condoms are in yellow, and then other types of contraceptive methods are in red. And this is only like the percentage of sexually active teenagers. And so this shows that a high percentage of them are using contraceptives, but again, I don't know how accurate that number is. Some of the reasons that teenagers may not use contraceptives is due to peer pressure and heightened emotions. So as I talked about, some of the changes in the brain, you're more focused on the rewards versus the risks, and that can lead to that sort of emotional reaction of wanting to engage in sex and not really thinking through the risks. And peer pressure can contribute to that. Tied into that, they tend to be unrealistic about the consequences, so they may underestimate the likelihood of getting pregnant or getting an STD from unprotected sex. But in addition to that, it's just the lack of information and access. So many teenagers may not know where to get contraceptives or how to use them, and even if they know where and how, they just might not have access to it. Especially whenever you're not old enough to drive and you don't have a job or income coming in yet, then you basically would have to rely on your parents or someone else to buy those contraceptives for you. And if you're not open, to talking about your parents about that kind of thing, then it's going to be really difficult to get a hold of contraceptives. Some of the challenges that they face is most teenagers believe that their parents will not be supportive of, providing them contraceptives, and that's true even if the parents themselves say that they would be supportive. And so even if a parent feels like like they're supportive, if they're not actively communicating that to their adolescent child, then the child's probably just going to assume, oh, my parents would never, buy me condoms or whatever. School sex education tends to offer incomplete information. So unfortunately, there's still a large number of schools that basically don't teach about contraceptive use at all. And so one of the places that adolescents could potentially get information would be from their doctor. But if they have like a family doctor, a doctor that sees both them and their parents, then they may be uncomfortable talking to that doctor because they may feel incorrectly like that doctor is not going to protect their confidentiality. And so with all these things combined, it's really difficult then to get the information that you need to use contraceptives safely and effectively. And so because of the lack of contraceptive use in some teenagers, there's obviously a higher incidence of sexually transmitted infections and diseases. And so we'll talk about that, and then we'll also talk about teenage pregnancy as well. The rates of STIs are rising in the US. Currently affects about 1 out of 5 or 20% of sexually active teens. And again, a lot of this comes down to some misinformation and misconceptions that teenagers have about sex. So one thing that they may not know is that females are actually more easily infected with an STI through heterosexual transmission, at least. And that's due basically just to the biology of the vagina. It has a thinner membrane compared to the skin around the penis, so it's easier for pathogens and things to get into the bloodstream. They tend to also underestimate how likely you are to get an STI from oral sex, and so even if a teenager hasn't had, penetrative vaginal sex, they are still likely to have engaged in oral sex and may believe that it's impossible to get an STI or spread an STI through that, which is incorrect. Low socioeconomic status teenagers tend to be at greatest risk for STIs, particularly if they have a sense of hopelessness, like if they feel like they're not going to escape that poverty, they're going to be stuck that way for the rest of their lives, then they're more likely. STI, so I think teenagers also tend to underestimate the consequences of an STI. They maybe don't realize that it can have pretty profound effects on your reproductive abilities, so it can lead to sterility, for example, and in some cases life-threatening complications. AIDS is obviously the most serious of all the STIs and STDs, and people often get that during their adolescence. So overall, I would just say teenagers are pretty poorly informed about STIs and what they could do to protect themselves.